Okay, so I'm super excited about this week's interview. I have now had at least 5 hours worth of conversation with Tarn Adams, who is the creator of Dwarf Fortress. And I'm excited to share at least about 2 hours of that with you, following some technical difficulties on my part. Um, but yeah, I'm just so excited that I had the opportunity to talk with Tarn, because what he's created with Bay 12 Games and Dwarf Fortress is something truly unique in the annals of history with regards to video games. So, without further ado, here is Tarn Adams. Right, exactly. I had hardly considered that. So I think one of my favorite things about doing research on you was watching the YouTube video you sent me. What was that guy's name?
Yeah, Christian. Yeah,
Christian.
yeah.
And you talk about your childhood, and how you actually, you were a child connected to technology far earlier than I feel like people are making claims like kids now are the first kids to be so connected with technology, but that's really not true.
Yeah, I mean,
And I
I
thought,
had to speak in math. It's like number stumper, level 1, level 3. You got my number. Your score is 4. Yeah, it's great stuff. I mean, I learned how to add numbers together and multiply numbers and 3 and 5 tenths. It was great. I mean, we had audio and so forth, such as it was. I certainly think the kids these days have like they had the internet and we had bulletin board systems and stuff like that, and that was not the same. And I see like my what are they? My cousins once removed, like my cousins' kids have these little tablets that have like these movies slash game things that they watch with cars driving around, and then they can just kind of, I'm talking about like a 3-year-old here, can just kind of swipe the window
mm-hmm.
open at like any time on the car or something, and that's like, but then the movie goes on, and it's sort of these weird interactive movies, just stuff that I wouldn't have seen growing up. And of course, there's all those weird YouTube videos that are sort of randomly made by robots for the kids to watch that are just terrifying. So I mean, I didn't grow up with things that would have made me into whatever the kids are going to become. But we had our own electronics, and we had like the Atari, and my house we had personal computers like the DOS ones, and also like a
Mm-hmm.
trash 80 TRS 80 with like that had basic on it and some little programs that we could download. But this was like back then we also typed in like we had magazines that had
Uh-huh.
basic code, and it was just like fill a few pages on the magazine and you would like type it in. And then it would run, and then you could play a little game. And it's weird because you can see like the ending of the game if it has one, right? It's like right there you type in like you win period like semicolon, then you put it in. It's like not a surprise anymore what it's like when you win. But like that hardly mattered, right? You because the I mean it's like knowing you win in chess is not like a big deal, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it even kind of led to our kind of initial stuff where we'd be hacking these old games that we download from the bulletin boards, is just like changing the text or changing the colors or changing how they work, because you realize pretty quick when you're typing in something from a magazine that you don't have to follow its instructions, right? Like if
Mm-hmm.
you understand what's going on, you can type in different words, you can move the words or whatever, and it's just a way of kind of learning. It all mushes together with everything else. I mean, learning to read and learning to code at the same time, you kind of learn like what does the word print mean to a kid who's 5 years old who's printing in basic, right? It's like print, and it's like, is it something computers do? But it has nothing to do with like a person who hasn't used computers would think of print as something completely different. It would be like the font or something, right, of a book they're reading or something, right, or a printing
Mm-hmm.
press or whatever. It just means something different than like display digital characters on a screen is, or locate. Like locate is a verb that puts something at a location on the screen. Yeah, it's just a really strange way of running into
Mm.
those words, and I think it's probably made me a strange person as a result.
So, when were you born?
I was born in 1978.
So we're not talking like the 90s. We're talking in the early 80s. You were really writing code already for games,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah. I mean, it's like the oldest games are way older than that, but like they were not. I mean, there wasn't a whole lot going on, right? I mean, there were some interesting games floating around on like what is it, like Illinois or something. There was like the little RPG games were born and stuff, and these little mud
Hmm.
style things in like 1975, and there were some arcade games floating around back then. But it was like, yeah, it was a really weird time to get involved because you're like not too far behind what like is being professionally produced or semi-professionally produced or independently produced, as if you have enough time to just kind of plug away at stuff. And a lot of people just kind of randomly got involved that way. And at the same time, there were like real businesses growing too, like Sierra and other game companies kind of springing up that time that were like these kind of rich and employed lots and lots of people, and not just kind of programmers, but just like people in mail rooms and hint lines and all that kind of stuff. So yeah,
and and then you have you and your brother who spend, I mean, you guys really, as a form of entertainment for yourselves, spent a lot of time creating games too, right?
yeah, it was almost like a flip of the coin when we'd go to school. We'd try and like finish as much homework in class as we could so that we'd kind of free up the day, but not to like go play outside, but to make the big decision, which is kind of like, are we going to play games today or are we going to write games today? And I don't. It wasn't like we had a committee like decide. And of course, we had like bristle blocks and Hot Wheels and Muscle Men and all the other weird things that were toys back then or whatever. And so those were on the table when we were younger, especially. But then there's like, yeah, it's like it just kind of happened that we're like, oh, now we're playing Ultima 3, or now we're playing I don't know, like some weird football game or some random thing, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
just like it could be anything. But then also it's like, oh, now we're firing up Borland like C, or we're firing up a quick basic, or we're listening to the little ping on the modem going like or whatever, and then let's go to Walnut Creek BBS and see if they have a new version of Hack to download or whatever. And it was all just part of the sort of computer ecosystem. And I don't remember fighting with my brother over the computer that much, or like arguing about what we were doing. It was just kind of this weird creative haze or something. And we have like I still have a lot of our old basic programs. There's just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them. Um, it's like finding old childhood drawings or something, right? Except it's like this is a game called Jack's Rat, where it prints a rat on the screen, and then you feed it, and then it tells you how your rat died. And it's just and it's not a game. It's just like a menu, and you go through. And there's no loop, right? You just answer 3 questions, and then it pops out a little procedurally generated like thing about your rat's tumor or whatever. And it's just like, well, that's a horrible little game. And but it was just a day, like not even a day's work. It was just like this. Here's 2 hours. We did this, and it was just like, yeah. I mean, the same thing that would cause a kid to just draw a picture of their parents or something. It's just like we didn't have a rat. I didn't have pet rats until grad school. I don't know where that came from. I don't know who Jack is either. Uh, just completely random.
Makes me think of those, those little paper fortune tellers.
Yeah,
Like
yeah, yeah.
it's just the computer version of that. Like, uh, it's kind of what it reminds me of. Little kids making those.
Yeah, the
Uh,
rat never had a good fortune though.
well, can you give me some more examples of some of the games that you kind of play or that you guys made, or how they the games got more and more advanced as you guys got more experienced.
Yeah, I remember like when the first big trend is because there's always this thing in like QBasic and these other programs where we
Mm-hmm.
had the one that was like this animated sort of martial arts adventure where it wasn't really a game at all, but it was like a branching movie that you'd watch of just people getting to fist fights and fighting giant chipmunks and other stuff, people with jet packs and things. I only vaguely remember the details, and it had about 40 files that would chain into each other. There was a command, a basic command called chain that would just take you to the next file because we didn't know how to share variables. I mean, it's probably possible in BASIC. I don't really know anything about BASIC anymore, but that you could like share variables because you'd run out of memory, right? We'd hit this. I don't remember if it was 32K or 64K. I mean, these are the numbers we're talking about here, like these little baby files, and you could only have so much code running through the interpreter or whatever, and then it would not make it, so you'd have to chain to a completely different file that doesn't remember the old file at all. You could kind of save and load data, and we did that a little bit later. But it's like we had that stage, and then we when we switched over to C, which is what happened when I was the summer before high school. I read Teach Yourself C in 21 days, and then
did it take 21 days?
No, 14. I was eager to go. And it was. I mean, it was really. I mean, it was just kind of like, oh wow, this is gonna make this whole game making thing a little bit easier, and it did. And it was because my father was a programmer. I didn't mention. It's like we
you guys bought the computer yourselves.
Yeah. I mean, it didn't just come from nowhere. We weren't like nagging like, well, we saw the computer on TV. Can you get us one of those? I'm sure that happened, but it was like for us, it was like my father was. Like a sort of, I wouldn't say early programmer because we're not talking like Ada Lovelace days or anything, but it's like he was the first person to kind of computerize wastewater treatment plants so that they could analyze the data more effectively and keep people safer. And that was kind of the his sort of entry into computers. He just left school. I mean, he graduated and just went into. He was going to either go into beer making or computers, and that was the decision. So we could have been like hard drinking kids, I guess, but instead we ended up with computers. And
if only you were dwarves.
Yeah. No, I mean, I could have been like tasting the latest microbrew or whatever as a 3-year-old, but instead we got basic. And so the reason I brought this up is because like my father was working with Pascal a bit at the time. I don't know if people use Pascal anymore, on Fortran and stuff. And he tried to teach us a little bit of those, but for whatever reason, I'm not really sure why, because I was like 12 years old, we ended up getting a C book instead. We didn't have any idea that people were like using C to write video games or anything. It's just how it shook out, and so that worked out really well. We were able to make much larger, more complicated games, and for instance, we had a basic game called I believe the first name of it was Inertia, which was this little pixels. Like we were drawing pixels in BASIC on the screen, which is just terribly slow. But we had a little. So we had, I believe it was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, because you make a little T shape, and that's a little ship, right? And it could fly around and leave little pixel mines. It was kind of like those Space War game, if people remember their 80s games at all, with the gravity and the inertial kind of Newtonian mechanics or whatever, and you try and shoot each other and so forth. And then when we got over to C, when we were like 16, 17 years old, we had like these bigger sort of 32 by 32 procedurally generated ships where it would glue on different wings and so forth, and like blow off. It did like a flood fill algorithm. So if you took like a plasma shot or whatever in one of your wings, it would blacken some of the pixels and then flood fill to see if the wing was still connected to the ship, and then it could separate it out into a separate kind of piece and break it off and make it fly away and stuff. There's like this kind of evolution that was allowed by the C programming, and we also had like I'm just remembering these things like Fast Graph and Diamondware Sound Blaster Kit and stuff. We had these libraries. Like it's weird thinking of like being 16 and 17 years old and like licensing libraries for use in games you're not going to release just because you want to see some better graphics and stuff. But that's what we did. I remember having my mom scream into a microphone because we had this inner city type urban warfare gang thing with I don't remember if it was post-apocalyptic or what, or if it was just based on like those those 80s TV things or whatever, but we had these, all kinds of gang members, male, female gang members, all shooting each other with Uzis because of course, it was Uzis at the time, right? And so we had my mom scream. We were like, "Mom, scream into the microphone! Mom, throw up into the microphone or whatever!" And we just had this horrible game. It kind of, I mean, it's acts kind of like the Dwarf Fortress Dragon, damage system was. Like in these games in various degrees because we were playing pen and paper stuff back then, and there was like cyberpunk was like there's this whole kind of non-hit point damage system about how the gunshots worked and critical wounds and stuff like that. It's like we didn't have any of those like Roll Master books back then where it got really kind of out of control, but the cyberpunk had a nice little system of body parts and critical wounds and so forth that managed to carry over into our little games we were writing ourselves. And it was just all part of this weird ecosystem of ideas and games we were playing, games we were writing, movies that we were watching, and all of that stuff was just a sort of a stew for us back then. I don't think that's really changed that much in terms of how we operate.
And would you say that a lot of those, I mean, every game that you and your brother have made since you were kids has the best parts of it, do you feel, are somewhere in Dwarf Fortress?
Almost entirely, yeah. I mean, I thought that pixel ship thing was cool. We haven't made blowing up pixel ships in Dwarf Fortress. Although, I mean, I guess if you considered like how the cave-ins work and so forth, they kind of use the flood fills the same way. But it's like it's not quite what we were thinking at the time. But and there's a lot of stuff that hasn't made its way over that has to do with like sci-fi stuff and like our evolution games and stuff like that. That didn't make it over and maybe won't. Who knows? I mean, things get strange because like Dwarf Fortress does suck in all of the ideas that we have. I mean, I guess. I mean, is this a convenient time to say what Dwarf Fortress is, or shall we hold off?
I feel like the suspension is great, but I feel like it's worth explaining what Dwarf Fortress is for sure.
Yeah, so we have like Dwarf Fortress is the game we're working on now. That's kind of been a culmination of these games we're talking about, and maybe we'll get back to like how we actually got there. But Dwarf Fortress,
we're working on.
Yeah, we're working. Yeah, it's an ongoing process for the last 16 years or so. And my brother and I have been writing this game. It's a sort of aspires to be a fantasy world simulator where you can kind of create your own fantasy setting that has its own kind of world map and history and so forth, and then you can assume a role within the world, and run it for a time, set the world down, it understands the changes that you've made and so forth, and then you can pick it up again in a different role sometime later and see what's happened. That's the aspirational form of it. What we have now is a colony simulator that takes place in such a world. So you just run like a colony of dwarves mining into a mountain, making crafts and squabbling with people, drinking and so forth. Dancing, yeah. There's dancing, musical instruments, and poetry and trade, and the occasional run-in with grizzly bears and other critters out in the forest.
Dwarf eating carps, maybe not anymore.
Yeah, I think they've. I mean, the carp were formerly violent fish that dragged people into the lake and ate them, and I think that's died down. It's one of these things where I think like this is like we feel out the community and read what they say, and it's like I believe we addressed the fact that carp had mouths like giant alligators that would eat people and drag them into the rivers. But I mean, if someone were to say, no, actually that's not fixed, we just stopped complaining about it, then that wouldn't surprise me at all. But yeah.
But what that's really about is, I guess, 16 years of creating a game and then adding layers of nuance as time has gone on. I guess that's kind of how I feel the development of Dwarf Fortress has been. I mean, because if you've been playing for 16 years, It's a very different game, I'm assuming, now than, vanilla.
Yeah, I mean the one because it's been out for 12, and so the one that like if you were playing it 16 years ago, you were me and my
Oh,
brother,
yes.
and it was like, here is a cliff face on the right hand side of the screen. Here is a dwarf, and you can dig little dig dug tunnels in there. I believe for a time that you could find these slime pockets that would attack you, and that didn't last for all that long, but it's like cave slime or whatever. Yeah, it's like the idea of Dwarf Fortress kind of being this sort of accreted layers of geology is not inaccurate, and it goes back further than 16 years. Like way back with Basic, we started with a game called Drag Slay because you're limited to 8 letters at the time, like Jack's rat. Maybe the reason that the rat it's belonged to Jack was because Jack was conveniently 4 letters long. So Jack's rat is 8 letters long, and so Drag Slay was Dragon Slayer, but 8 letters, and that was a very simple kind of D&D-esque game where you'd go through a sequence of a few fights, and then you'd fight a dragon, and then you'd fight like 10 more fights, and then you'd have a dragon. Just things like, you're fighting a skeleton now. Yeah, I mean, there was not a lot of innovation there. I believe it even had like the D&D armor class system. And keeping in mind, this is something we wrote when I was like 10 years old. And it had like, so you'd have like armor class 5 when you had chainmail and that kind of thing or whatever. And you'd find treasures and fight dragons. And we were like, at the same time, we were playing like our we were very satisfied playing these kind of role-playing games, computer role-playing games like the Ultimas and so forth, which were slowly getting more complicated themselves, like while we were working. And so we didn't, think to make things too complicated, and we were running into those barriers anyway, right? So it's like, once we got to C, we were suddenly like presented with a lot more memory, and we could suddenly, and also we were just getting older and had seen more games and had our own ideas about what it meant to generate things, right? Because the roguelike games, you could generate maps and you generate items, and in games like Starflight, they would generate planets. You could generate like a 3D map of a planet, and then when it would come in and zoom in and land, and then they'd have like this 2D map, and you could find life forms, and there were procedurally generated randomized life forms on the planets. And then you had games like Sim Earth, which had procedural Earth maps that then evolved over time as continents drifted and ice meteors struck them and volcanoes and all that kind of thing. And then there was games like Civilization had world maps. Then there were games like Seven Cities of Gold that were like they had the same map every time. I think you could. There was a randomized option maybe, but you would, but it was just like sort of a big evocative map when you hit it. And so we had all these things kind of mushed in our head at once, and we were like, why can't you make a map like in Civilization or Starflight, but play your kind of Ultima style game on it, right? It's like, why can't you make like a roguelike world map generator or an Ultima generator? And so we just started doing that, and it wasn't long before we had altitude maps, and we had villages that were placed, and little ogres that would go around and wreck the buildings in the in the villages. But there'd also be these caves where there'd be like goblins and other creatures like that you'd go into, and if they died, it would save the name of your character so they could make fun of you when you meet them again. And they'd put the skull of your character outside of the entrance to the cave, and you'd get a nice little pile going because the character that killed you would gain a level in the game and become more difficult. They'd have like, I think we had little weapon skills back then in that one. We're talking now like this is the C version of Drag Slay, so it starts to blend for like 93, 94, 95, 96. And I think around 97 is when we finally stopped, and that was when I was in undergrad. I just started at University of Washington at that point. And this is all sort of history of Dwarf Fortress stuff. All just leads into what Dwarf Fortress became. Because when I was, we had kind of that big space game going and the big RPG going when I was an undergrad, and then I kind of got serious about mathematics for like a whole year in there and didn't really do a lot of programming. That was when I was doing like grad school applications and all that kind of stuff. It actually, became an issue of time and so forth, and maybe an issue of thinking about getting serious about being a mathematician, which lasted like 6 months. But I still went to grad school, right? I went down to California, and uh, at that point, I just ended up with a lot of free time again. It's the like I shouldn't have ended up with a lot of free time because if I had been more serious about my classes and so forth. But you need to have a hobby. Everyone in grad school had a hobby, whether they were riding unicycles or juggling or whatever, right? There was a lot of different things going on down there. And for me, it was just going back to the computer again. And because of how kind of like I wasn't used to studying. I wasn't used to taking notes. I mean, I never took notes in college. I never took notes in high school or whatever. And then when I hit grad school, I was like, I really need all of these study habits that people have been diligently practicing for their whole lives up to this point. And now I'm like, I was just, falling behind. Failed my qualifying exams eventually, but I didn't know it at the time. I was still in my first year there, and I was just kind of struggling with things. And so really out of character for me, especially at the time, was creating a website. Like I still don't play multiplayer games and go to chat rooms and stuff like that. So it's like really weird, and I still can't quite get my head around the frame of mind I was in back in 2000. December of 2000, this was 18 years ago, December of 2000 created the Bay 12 Games website and a forum, which is even stranger, right? And put up the game we were working on at the time, my brother and I, and he was living back up in Washington. We just kind of correspond by email, which was, not something we had until I got to school at University of Washington, and we started sending emails. And I had the game we were working on at the time was Slaves to Armok, God of Blood, which was a kind of graphical version of what we had wanted to do. Because part of making the game more interesting and making these nice-looking maps and so forth was that it was just, we wanted it to be visually interesting too. We wanted to make like, basically spore type critters before spore existed or whatever, like procedurally generate the creatures too. And we ended up doing that. We have like these weird quadrupeds with weird texture patterns. They all look blocky and terrible, but they can kind of shamble toward you in that game. And there were procedural animations. You could like walk on your hands or walk on one hand and one leg, and they looked terrible. I'm not saying we had like a technological revolution here. It was just a very weird way of thinking about the game because, like, the Drag Slay game, the C one, was put together well and sort of built up over time, but we didn't really attain some of our big goals. We wanted to have kind of these flourishing sort of civilizations and NPC characters that were interesting and so forth. Never really got to that. So we're like, if we want to attain these things, we were like, well, let's start from the bottom up. Let's build what it really means to have a creature, right? And so we have this really complicated definition for creatures with materials, and materials make up tissues, and they all have like weird boiling points and flash points, and the tissue can have a growth coming out of it, which would be hair in the case of, say, your arm, and then like what color is that? How curly is it? How dense is it? And we built up this whole thing and had this really kind of creepy damage system that led to like these procedural weird spell definitions and stuff. And I think we were just starting out with that, so we had some hard-coded ones that like you could remove the skin from somebody and it would change their texture to their muscle texture or whatever. It was very disgusting. Or you could teleport their nose. There was the teleport body part spell, which would take a body part from the tree, sever it, and then you could move it to a different location. And it, created the little textures and so forth. And it's the kind of thing that you can imagine them, doing with games today, as they've started bifurcating people and so forth. But it was weird back then. It was something you didn't really see much of or any of. And but we just had this weird sort of bottom-up approach. And the strange thing about that is, like, we never had a town in that game. We never really had other characters that you could meet or talk to. But we did have a, like, calculate the position that the arrow you're firing in a windstorm is going to land at using, like, a kind of, like, approximation for a partial differential equation or whatever weird stuff that we were doing at the time. and that's not a good idea. And that game was just kind of trundling along, right? We were releasing it on the internet, and there were people playing it. And look, I mean, playing is such a strong word. They were just kind of like watching the process and eager for something to materialize, right? Because they saw that we were working and that we were serious and that we had, we were able to produce what we said we were going to produce, even if the ideas that we had were strange and not really going anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
So we had people following us, and by the time we get to Dwarf Fortress, there's a couple hundred people on there, and but at the same time we felt sort of obligated, and just because of our childhood really and how we produced all those little games, we released side projects, right? We had a lot of side projects on there. Nothing that ever really got traction. The only ones that anybody listening to this thing might have heard of are Liberal Crime Squad and World War I Medic. World War I Medic got on a CD that was shipped with Computer Gaming World, and Liberal Crime Squad has floated around the internet a bit. These are all just little free games, and they never took more than like a few weeks to write. Right, just put one up and people could play it, and then we go back to Slaves to Armagh, God of Blood, and just spill some life back into that again. And so we had one we were working on in 2002 in October. We just like Zach and I are working on this game called Mutant Miner, which was just going to be a couple weeks project where it's basically like there was an old game called VGA Miner where you'd go down a mine shaft and dig out these kind of dig dug style tunnels, and you kind of go down the screen is deeper in the mine, and you'd find rocks and things down there, and there were flooding hazards and so forth. I mean, there was some whole kind of plot about you're getting married or something. You had to end up putting dynamite under the outhouse to get the wedding ring out or something. But I don't really recall. But that was kind of the game, right? And that was VGA Miner, and so we took that and thought about Dig Dug and some other games, and we're like, okay, I want to make a mining game like that, because there weren't mining games. This is like way before Minecraft and Terraria and things like that. There just weren't a whole lot of games about mining through a space like that. And we wanted to play around with the idea. So the idea was that you would go down, mine, find minerals, but also find like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle mutagen canisters, bring them back to a kind of vat you could throw yourself in and grow more arms to carry more pickaxes to mine faster. And there, it's a game loop, right? That's interactive entertainment at its best. And so that was a silly game, and we eventually had the really terrible idea that you could have additional miners. And I don't know where that idea came from, because it was very bad, because the game was turn-based, and you would switch between the miners between turns. So you're like, click down, and then it pops the camera over, click down. And then so you'd end up sort of getting a seizure, right? Just popping back and forth, back and forth, back and forth between these different views. And it was like, we're just like, this game's not working. And so I was thinking about it for a while, call up Zach, and we had this kind of epic 3-day, I mean, there was sleeping involved, but it was basically a 3-day phone call. I don't know what happened to work, or if this was during the summer. Oh, no, it was October, so no, I had no excuse. I was actually shirking whatever duties I had at, maybe it happened on the weekend, a long weekend. The long weekend, yes. Okay, and so we had this call, and we came to the conclusion, okay, the game's got to be real time, and it's going to be about dwarves digging into a mountain, and you carve out like little living spaces, because we were kind of thinking with Mutant Miner, we saw the little buildings at the top where you played with your picks and mutagen and stuff. We were like, it's cool to have this little sort of colony or whatever, and it's cool, like dwarves do that, right? And so you dig into this mountain, and you make little workshops and make crafts and things out of the minerals that you find. And then because they're dwarves, they eventually delve too greedily and too deep and, get roasted by something, or something otherwise bad happens to them. And then the neat idea we had is that you'd go in there playing a traditional roguelike turn-based adventure game after this real-time game, and kind of find the remnants of your dwarven civilization, along with like whatever caused them to go away, which is what makes it a kind of roguelike game. There might be a Balrog in there, or orcs or whatever. And you could find like the treasures, and it would generate diaries and stuff that your dwarves left. And so your first part of the game would set the maximum score you could attain of like archaeological discovery, and then when you actually play through the one adventure, you'd get as many points as you could out of that maximum score. And then there's like an actual score list, and you put 3 letters or whatever, like the arcade. It's like you got 1,233 points in Dwarf Fortress, and it's here's it on the list, and can you beat your friends or whatever. And that was the idea. I mean, and that's still a game that you could write in a couple months or whatever, right? I mean, it'd be funny if someone attempted to do like the like what Dwarf Fortress would have been like if they had actually stuck with the original design document. And and that's like, I mean, so it's a neat little project, and start in October, kind of finish it by Christmas break or something was the plan. Get that up and then go back to Armagh and kind of just whittling away at that. And what we noticed, because Dwarf Fortress is a text graphics game and not a 3D graphics game, that we had a lot of fun just adding like you can add 4 ideas in a day now. You don't have to draw anything. And it's like, here it goes. Now we've got all these workshops and these mining dwarves, and we had that in a couple days, right? It's like, what is stopping you from doing that in just a few days? And there they are. And then we're like, oh, this is cool. We need to make why not make the fighting with orcs or whatever it was going to be like Drag Slay, right? Just do the body part damage systems and all this other cool stuff. Just throw it in there. What does inventory look like? Do you have to make little dwarven soldiers all of a sudden? And what about like who these dwarves are, right? Because in Mutant Minor, no one had names, but these dwarves got names really quickly, and and it made them into little characters, right? And it's like all of the things that we learned from our other games about how to sort of do these emergent narrative and stuff. And like, there's this whole other kind of branch of the conversation about how Drag Slay worked when we got to the C version, where Zach and I were passing these notebooks around that had chapters that we'd write in like a fantasy story, and then we'd think like, how can we make this story appear in the computer, and like, what are the mechanics we need to make this happen? And then we'd put them in the game, and then lo and behold, suddenly your emergent narratives are way better because you have these narratively interesting moments happening in your game that you're thinking about, how do I produce these things? And that's kind of a becoming, or has become, or is a sort of traditional sort of game tool now. And like AAA, they have things like user stories and stuff like that, or whatever. Player moments, like how do we generate story moments or whatever. And it's also ties back into like how procedural generation works. So like, if you want to make a medieval looking town, you draw a bunch of them on a tablet first, right? And then you say like, how do I make one of these? And then you come up with rules that make it happen. And so doing a story, it's like, maybe it can work the same way. You write down a story and say, how can I make this happen? Of course, in practice, it doesn't work quite so cleanly because like, if a story, if you say like, the cleric nodded knowingly after hearing that bit of wisdom from the beggar or something. I mean, how do you get that to happen in a game procedurally where it actually isn't, I mean, it's not a scripted moment, but it's like the cleric realized that the bit of wisdom that they heard was an actual bit of wisdom, and they were able to, emote using the nodding action, blah, 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 or whatever. And it's like, I mean, you can kind of build up what that means, but also, I mean, you need like this whole sort of like ontological framework to understand what a good idea is or whatever. And, we're getting there. We're
and
slowly,
yeah. And so you meant October to December of
2002. And that was 16 years ago. That's where the 16 years figure comes from that we're rolling up on here. Because the Dwarf Fortress release anniversary was on August 8th, so that was just a week ago, was our 12th year anniversary for our release, but our anniversary for sort of the conception of Dwarf Fortress, I'd throw more in the October. I mean, I'd have to go back and look. I don't remember early October, late October. I'm not sure if there's even any evidence anymore of like when that happened precisely. Probably there is, but because it was a secret at first. But then in 2004 or so, we told people we were working on this Dwarf Fortress game, which we were still working on 2 years later, because it had started like sucking the ideas from Armagh like a black hole, just like it was so easy to add things, like I was saying, that it started to borrow from Armok. It's just like
Mm-hmm.
Armok had this tissue idea. That didn't happen for a while. I think that was post-release for Dwarf Fortress, but it eventually got in the game. We've got hair in Dwarf Fortress now. I don't remember if it talks about how curly your arm hair is, so there's still a future struggle. But it does know what your arm hair is made out of. It knows what color it is. It guess it knows how long it is. That's a strange thing to care about, but it's there. And why not? And of course, cue all audience members saying, like, here are 20 reasons why not to add arm hair to your game. The first being that it's a waste of time and you should work on other things. This is true, but it still happened. I think almost as kind of like an homage to Armok or whatever. But the important things from Armok made their way over too. We have procedural creatures
Mm-hmm.
that are generated in Dwarf Fortress. If you want to see like fan art for those, just search for Forgotten Beast on Google image search, and you'll get pages of drawings of cool things that people have drawn. And it's particularly gratifying because when Zach and I were growing up, when we were playing Starflight, that space exploration game with the
Mm-hmm.
procedural life forms, we had these, I forgot what they're called, like Scholastic notebooks or something, the ones with the mottled black and white pattern.
Yeah.
And we had like a bunch of those, and we'd fill them with drawings of procedural creatures, which were in Starflight was basically just a Mad Libs paragraph with that had like here's 20 choices of an adjective and so forth, paired with a like little 12 by 12 or something icon on screen for like this is a amoeba-like life form or this is a bipedal life form. But then it would be like this is a bipedal life form that has an ambling gait and fuzzy antenna, right? And so we're like, oh, cool, let's draw that, all right. And it's like just enough information to get your brain running on that stuff, right? And so Dwarf Fortress has that kind of thing now, where it gives you a paragraph description. But of course, the paragraph description is also backed up by like all of the sort of mechanical stuff we were talking about, like body parts and tissues
Mm-hmm.
and modes of attacking and that kind of thing that fit into the computer game and the mechanical side of it. Uh, so yeah, that's where my train of thought derails. But I think
No.
we that yeah, go ahead.
One of my favorite things is that you guys haven't moved towards a traditional 3D graphics game. The game still is,
Oh yeah,
yeah,
yeah. I mean
yeah. It's still ASCII.
the modding community, of course, has done amazing things. The modding community's
Mm-hmm.
produced tile sets, which make it playable for people. Like
Shout out to the Lazy
yeah,
Noob Pack. That's how I played it the first time.
yeah.
That's my many failures at Dwarf Fortress.
And then there's Stone Sense, which makes it isometric, and then
Ooh.
there's the ongoing Armok Vision project, which makes it 3D. So
Oh.
I mean so it's like why would we make it 3D? Because we'd just be wasting our time doing a horrible job when there's people out there that are talented, doing interesting things with it, and they all share with each other. We share the game. It's available for free up on the website, and it's like yeah. So it's like I mean at the same time we have little side projects we work on that are kind of run the gamut of sort of graphical options and other weird things. Not that we're trying to make things look nice, but it's like we have plenty of side projects unreleased. So we I don't think we've released a major side project since Dwarf Fortress came out. It's like it's a strange thing, right? Because the standards change or whatever. Like once you get into an art museum or whatever, you're like, do I really want to like release these things? And they'll be like, we don't know if this is like the juvenilia of this artist, but they apparently released this game when they were 40 years old. Um, it's like it doesn't. Yeah, it's a strange set of expectations. I may only half care about that, but it's like, yeah. So we haven't finished anything and released. And plus, polishing a project, as anyone will tell you, is one of the more annoying parts of game development. So why do that if you don't have to? It's just kind of like a continuation of what Zach and I did as kids, and we do it sort of on our free time.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, so there's but for Dwarf Fortress, we had a thing like years and years and years ago. Zach drew up like a tile set and stuff, and we were thinking about packing one in, but this kind of coincided with the rise of really good community tile sets and stuff. And then there's like this whole other thing of like, would we want to sort of maintain a kind of vanilla tile set that we just kind of source from the community or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, like I don't even know how we'd pick one, right? I mean, that's really hard.
It's like things get a little dicey there, but um, but but there's definitely something to be said about major milestones in the game, and how it's progressed over the last 14 years of public release, right?
Yeah, well, 12, 12. It's like
12. I'm
the
sorry, I
average, the
told you I'm
average.
bad with numbers.
Well, the average of 12 and 16. You're just great at averaging things. And,
You're too kind.
in a stupid way too. But it's like yeah. So the let's see, major. Yeah, I mean there were so there's the release of the game in 2006, and like that was it was kind of this weird sort of life changing event. Whereas like we were kind of busking for money, and people would actually give us money, and we had a community, right, all of a sudden.
Mm-hmm.
And so now we're able to work on this game, and like we start to like I mean, there's just horrible bugs with it from the beginning. This is a tradition of Dwarf Fortress. It's never not been compromised by certain bugs and so forth. And in the early versions, when it was 2D, meaning just one slice of ASCII text landscape, you can start to think about like what is and the slice is like looking down like Google Maps or something, not a cross section like the Dig Dug games. Because in a cross section game, you can kind of think of like, whoa, water flows downhill, right? That's easy to manage. But how do you do water in this looking down version? Because we have this thing where you mine into a cliff face, you eventually hit a river, and the river has this kind of Nile pattern to it where it would seasonally flood, and so the water would come out from the river into like these floor tiles, and it would be dangerous for dwarves because they could drown in the river. But you could also do things like dig channels and place bridges to like make the water go where you want to go, and also walk over the water when safely with a bridge. And you start to get into this thing of like, if you have water in a channel that goes under a bridge, you don't want to print it, but the water's still there flowing, but the water can't flow up on the bank, and you start to get to weirder edge cases, right? Which I don't want to try and verbally describe because you'd have to like draw them with a marker or whatever it is. And it's like it really is just a mess, right? 2D fluids are like looking down and just getting them to flow right, and all that kind of stuff. We eventually decided, like a year or so after the release, we're gonna, and this is kind of a Dwarf Fortress tradition, we're gonna fix this problem with the fluids, but we're gonna fix it with just absolutely blowing up the game and turning it into something different. And so we're going to add 3 dimensions, and that's what we did. We made the game into a 3D slices that you could look at, and now water flows down. And if you want to dig a channel, it actually occurs at a different Z altitude. And if you want to build a bridge, it exists at one altitude, and the water exists underneath it. And it all just worked, right? And we even threw in a little pressure thing so that water could flow up the other side of a tube, and that kind of thing. It's all really cool. And that was like the first big attempt at updating a piece of software like that. We had never really done that before. Armok had big changes, but it was never really a game to begin with, so if the big change was crap, it just didn't matter. But now we wanted to take something that was starting to have thousands of people play it and turn it into this other game and carry them along, and also have them wait for this update, which, I mean, it sounds weird, like maybe even mentioning that nowadays, because there are like tons of patches like that and tons of like games that operate on systems like that now, but this just wasn't terribly common at the time, outside of maybe like the roguelike community, which is kind of where we had a whole anchor in that. So maybe it helped us keep our audience in the beginning, actually, having that kind of mindset, like people used to like those kind of waits for changes. And but then it worked, right? We did this release, and then other kind of milestones like that are like we had this history generation where you generate a couple hundred or more years of history in your world, and then you'd play the game after that, right? But then history would sort of stop. There'd be like no births. There'd be no like new sort of takeovers of sites by armies or beasts running around or anything happening. And one of the big releases that the dates all get fuzzier and fuzzier. It'd be something like 2012 or 2014 or something like that. Was activating the world after you begin playing, so that there's when you're running your colony and making goblets and so forth, there's a whole world worth of things going on, 1,000 or so like things moving around like particles, but they're like, I'm a traveling bard moving from one town to another. All of that stuff is going on. There's nothing faked about that in Dwarf Fortress. And yeah, so we'll assume that the z coordinate was the first big kind of change that the community went through, and then I think it was I'm totally blanking on whether it was 2012 or 2014, but another example of like a big change that we had in Dwarf Fortress was like you have your like we talked about like your world history a little bit, right? Like in Dwarf Fortress, you create this fantasy world. It runs 200-300 years of history, however much patience you have, right? I mean, we have a person that ran 10,000 years. I'm still not sure how that works, but because they were interested in libraries and looking at how the books changed. But in any case, you run this history, you stop the history, and you start a Dwarf Fortress, right? But up until the unknown year of 2012 or 2014 or whatever, the history stopped basically once you started playing the game, right? Because it can't run this sort of abstract history simulation while you're playing. Mm-hmm. And so whenever like you defeated the Goblin General or whatever, that was kind of it for that Goblin General for their whole civilization, and they just wouldn't have another one, and the goblins would all slowly disappear from the earth. It was kind of like the sort of fading of the elves and stuff from Tolkien, but it was the whole world. It was just like births stop, like like placing people in government positions stops. People don't move. There are no more invasions except for your fortress or whatever. And so we decided, I mean, it was part of the plan the whole time to change that, but like actually doing it as a whole other thing, and that ended up taking 26 months.
Wow.
That was the longest wait we've ever had people endure, is a little over 2 years. And amazingly, I mean, people just, we kept them up to date on what we were doing. And by that time, that was, this is after like, either 6 or 8 years of Dwarf Fortress sort of releasing and kind of keeping our promises and so forth. So people knew we were good for it. We're just like, hey, we're going to work on this. Going to take a while. We weren't sure. I mean, we got that wrong. We thought it was going to take a year, obviously, or something, and we just were wrong about that.
And Dwarf Fortress is only supposed to take 2 months. So.
Yes, so it's a consistent failure in that regard, and so it's been good. I mean, but they followed us along for that one, and that was a big one, and that one worked really well. And now what we're kind of looking forward to in this, up maybe starting around the end of the year, is this whole thing that now we know how it works, right? We're just calling it the big wait, and maybe it'll be 2 years, right? This time when we're going to do procedural creation myths and randomized kind of magic systems that are kind of consistent in a way that they wouldn't be if you were just like, here's different ranges on your fireball or whatever. It's like it would really make a consistent fantasy setting, right? And part of what it means to be in a fantasy setting is that there's some kind of supernatural thread through the universe, right? And that's what we're shooting for. We're going to try and make Dwarf Fortress have like 2 different worlds, would just be very, very different from each other. One might relate to how there's kind of one island that rose from the sea, and that's where everybody lives, and that there's magic systems that are based on weather and rivers and things, and there's the giant tortoise that holds up the earth, and maybe it can poke its head around to visit or something like that. And then there'd be another world that was like, in the time before time, there was just a a lake of dry mud or whatever, and then the flowers sprang from that because of what the celestial ibis did or whatever. And that would be a different story, right? It would be a maybe a world where people venerated flowers, whereas over in our island world, flowers are just things that grow on the island, and people are like, cool, I like flowers for regular reasons, but I can't take a flower and make the harvest grow, or I can't make the flower and tie it into like a little wreath that I put on my head, and now my headache is cured or something. So it's like this like, whether you're speaking to a game designer or not, like saying that is our next thing is just kind of pie in the sky stuff, except like we're good for it. I mean, it's been a while, and we're going to do it. We like a couple of years ago at GDC, we showed like the prototype myth generator that demonstrated how you can take like mythological objects like these creatures and cosmic eggs and chaos that's either formed from like fire or monsters or something, and then the different sort of god concepts you can have, and early races of Titan type creatures, or maybe you don't have that and it's just a bunch of sort of nature spirits in the beginning or whatever, right? There's all kinds of different concepts of how it can work, and whether it's a cyclic type of thing, or whether or not you're headed toward one apocalyptic oblivion and then the game would actually be over because there is no universe anymore, right? And then how you can take those sort of broad strokes and then take the sort of conceptual ideas within them and then form the little bits, like this is how the sort of operatic singing magic works in this universe, because the whole universe is based around sound or something like that, right? But then you drill down into the details of what does it mean to miscast a singing spell, right? And that can be like maybe you just get a bad cough for a few days, or maybe you cough up a lung, right? I mean, it's hard to say. And then you just, you can set up, get to work with your usual balancing and so forth of like, you'd have like the stronger spell effects that make you cough up a lung if you screw them up, and then the not so strong ones that just make you get a bad cough. And you don't have to make the balance perfect, because what it means to be in a fantasy universe is that it's unbalanced by something, right? It compared to the real world, we are in a state of unbalance because there's magic or something.
Right.
And so as long as the game can recognize systemically what's going on and then make the game react, so that suddenly operatic singers are sort of a powerful force in this world, or maybe they're a persecuted force. It depends on kind of like what their magic does. But as long as you feel like things are reacting, and then you kind of get this sort of thing that springs up, and it's like, maybe I'm reading a cheap book now, a really cheap book. But, it would be a library of tens of thousands of terrible books to read, and that's what we're trying to give people.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, good.
Can you hear me?
Yes, it's like, I think it's actually at my end. I think my connection keeps dropping because you come back, and so I think it's on my end. And I have two roommates that I think are playing video games on the internet.
Well, that's appropriate enough. So yeah, I don't know, how you can get my attention. I'm very good at rambling. I could just ramble for an hour. Because
it's like
notice.
I lost you, and then I came back, and you were still talking. I came back in at operatic singers, and I was like, "Fuck, that sounds so interesting."
Well, you can go when you're editing. You'll get a chance to listen back to what's going on. But it does make your job of asking follow-up questions complicated.
I kind of know where I want to go from here, pretty much, because we've kind of now gone through Dwarf Fortress up to its current state. You've talked about Dwarf Fortress now extensively, and kind of the ways in which it's changed and what they can look forward to. And you kind of offhandedly mentioned it earlier, but you mentioned the fact that you guys were included in an art museum for Dwarf Fortress.
Yes, that's correct.
And I think that I'm really interested in this story.
Yeah, so that was kind of a culmination of a series of events, right? So we release the game, and uh, it doesn't blow up, but it kind of like what is the word that's slightly stronger than sputtering, right? It chugs, it chugs,
Chugs is a good
it
word.
continues to chug along, right? And you know, now we're making $800 a month. Now we're making $1,000 a month. Now we're making $1,200 a month. And you know, it's not enough for two people to live on, but it's enough for me to kind of scrape by at first. And so I went full time,
Mm-hmm.
and in a year afterward. And of course, Texas A&M, which we haven't talked about, that was
No.
where I did my postdoc at after I left Stanford. I somehow was still clinging to this math thing while working on Dwarf Fortress, and ended up at a postdoc at Texas A&M. And the like it was clear though, like I was not going to be able to continue on in math. I just wasn't, you know, working long enough hours
Mm-hmm.
on it. And nicely, they let me stick around and teach business math and other classes that are enjoyed the campus round
That
by each student that
this
has to take them,
were
which is all of
it
them.
was a specific bane of my existence in my time at Texas A&M, and although our paths did not overlap, I don't think. What year was that? When you were teaching?
Yeah, 2000, 2005, 6,
No,
7
I
ish.
didn't get here until 2010. So we didn't quite overlap, but my favorite thing was reading your AMA on Reddit and
Hmm.
somebody saying that they couldn't believe that their Math 141 TA was doing an AMA on Reddit. And
Yeah, that was so cool because I mean that was really cool because when I released the game, that was before my second year began there. So when I started my second year, Dwarf Fortress was already out, and it had only been out for like some weeks before classes started, and I get into class and people have played it. And so I was like, I had students in my class that would play my games that would come to my office hours and just talk about video games all of a sudden. That was like that wasn't what I was my first year there, but that's what I was my second year there. It's like people just talking about video games and stuff. And it was just a fun time teaching three classes. You know, was it semesters or quarters? I don't even remember.
yeah,
But it was
semesters.
three because I've been at both like back and forth, and it just gets really hard to remember. And so it's like yeah, so three classes a semester, and like people in every class have played the game or whatever, and there's just like it gets to be a very entertaining like yelling back and forth classroom environment and stuff. Hopefully not to the detriment of the education of the people there, but I think it was fine. And yeah, so like there's this whole thing going on, right, where the game is like it's like becoming a little more popular. There's enough people around. They're kind of supporting me going full time, and then that coincided. And what I'm getting to is like that coincided with like a whole sort of press noticing the game, right? It's like
Oh.
now we get interviews for like game magazines. Now, like I remember, like just a couple months after the release, I think it was like we get a Gamers with Jobs podcast. Neither of us had been in any public recordings of any kind in our lives. My brother and I on this joint podcast, and like we just like my brother froze up, and then I was sitting there like not saying anything for 10 seconds, and I was like, office hour power, I will start talking now or whatever. And it's like I just started blabbering on, and it's like office hours and that podcast experience just broke me. It turned me into like this rambling blabbermouth where I was a very quiet child, you know, like I was saying, no multiplayer games, no chat rooms for me,
Mm-hmm.
nothing like that. But now I'm just like blah 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 blah. And yeah, it just comes out of those kind of crucible experiences where if you have like 10 doe-eyed students like staring at you like, tell me about calculus now, and it's just like, okay, I'll tell you about calculus now. It's like here's it's just yeah, I mean you either yeah, didn't really see anyone fail to get that in grad school. It seems like something that you just have to get or not. um
Right.
and yeah, so we get these things like this podcast, and then now we're getting this thing, and then suddenly this got approached by Jonah Weiner from the he's like the New York Times Magazine and Rolling Stone. And he mostly does music
Mm-hmm.
articles, right? Like this kind of profiles of musicians. and but his friend who worked at like the IT department somewhere, it was just this guy he knew in New York or whatever, one of his friends, was of course a Dwarf Fortress player, right? And so it's like, you should check this out because if you've got this whole computer game industry or whatever, which is a big thing now and in entertainment and so forth. And here's something really weird that's going on in the computer game industry that you might want to check out. So he actually came over here and stayed in town in the little hotel in town, and like we're in the middle of nowhere, Silverdale, Washington, west of Seattle, across the water on a ferry boat. And he came and stayed in the little hotel here and basically lived at my apartment for 5 days or however many days it was, right? That's why the New York Times Magazine article about Dwarf Fortress like references our refrigerator and stuff, like what was in there, even though we left that stuff there for him. It wasn't like our food or whatever. I'm not going to air all my grievances, but it's like, but it was like a really weird experience, right? And we have like we made the graphics for that article was like ASCII versions of Zach and I's faces, and like we made that, and then it got put in the New York Times Magazine or whatever. It's just really strange, and like we made it for them by making like this weird like photo to text thing that I still have or whatever. It's just very strange that all of that happened. But what happened after that was like so now we're in like the New York Times Magazine, and like when at the same time the Museum of Modern Art in New York, the MoMA, was like, we want to start putting video games in museums. And so when they get people together to talk about like who should get in or whatever, then we have like this sort of New York, very slight sort of cultural cachet now, or whatever you'd call it, where a few people in those circles, including the IT guy at the MoMA, naturally, has played the game, and I think they talked to Jonah about it. And then there's also the person that runs 256, which was a conference in Brooklyn, also had a PBS like games hour station or games like program about tech and games or whatever. And I'm totally blanking on his name right now, which is why I'm like listing off all of his accomplishments, and I'm like, I see your face. What is your name? And it's because this is like 7 years ago or whatever, and it's like so now I'm being rude. But so they got together at a coffee shop with and I'm just making part of this story up. I think they got together at a coffee shop. I think that's what happened with the Paula Antonelli, who's the curator of design at the museum, and they're like, here's our list of 14 games or whatever, and they had like a wish list of 40 games, and they're like, here are 14 games, 7 old ones, 7 newer ones that would be cool for the museum. And there was like this, I'm missing a thread of this because we were in a temporary exhibit called like Talk or something. And that's kind of how we got tied in with the 256 thing, and how we kind of like, they printed this giant Dwarf Fortress map, like 12 feet tall, and put it on the wall in the museum at the time. But that was just like a little couple months exhibit or something. And so it's just all, but that came out of the New York Times article, right? So there's just like this circle of New York stuff going on, and suddenly you're in like permanently acquired by the MoMA. That's how it works. And it's like there's Vincent Van Gogh's Starry Night, and there's a little video monitor showing Dwarf Fortress. It's like, okay, well, it's like we'll go for that. I don't know that our monitor is always showing, because they've got 40 games now. I think they like cycle and stuff or whatever. So I have no idea if you could like go to the MoMA now and like see the little video. But it was funny because like, how do you show Dwarf Fortress? Because they have like games there, say take Passage or something, right? It's like you could play that game with a joystick. You walk around, you get old, and then you die. I think that's how the game works, right? And so it's a little joystick game. You just move around. But Dwarf Fortress, you like, would you give someone like a keyboard and like, here are the 80 keystrokes you need to know to start this game or whatever. And so they had it was one of the people, and I'm going to start getting names backwards here, between like Captain Duck and I believe it was Captain Duck, did the video tutorials for Dwarf Fortress and produced a video that of like playing, and then Zach and I kind of I believe Zach and I wrote the script for it of like how what it should say like for the captions. And so there's like a 5 minute video that shows the dwarves moving around, and I think they get flooded with magma and stuff or whatever. And it's like it just describes what's happening, and that's like how you show that video game at a museum, because they have video games at like the EMP here in
Mm-hmm.
Seattle, which is like the Experience Music Project Museum, which has a lot of cool stuff. If you get to Seattle, if you like want to see like David Bowie labyrinth gear and stuff, great place to check it out. But they have a video game section now, and so you can play like Porpentine games or whatever if you want to play like Crystal Warrior Kesha or something. You want to type, and you can play those right because you just like click the commands and stuff right. And yeah, Zach and I sat down for interviews that they play on like the monitors in there, so you can like that was kind of our little contribution to that one. So yeah, there's this whole kind of video games museum undercurrent to what happened too, and there's like yeah, it's just been a weird experience, the whole thing. Like we ran a Zach and I like ran a podcast with two of the Bay 12
Mm-hmm.
volunteers, Rain Seeker and Captain Tastic for years. And that's that kind of we dropped off on that, but it's like that was something I'd never anticipated doing. It's like just all sorts of stuff like happens when you have a website, as I'm sure you're going to experience yourself, right?
Right, exactly. And have you experienced any of that, like around around where you live?
I,
People recognizing you?
Yeah, yeah. There, it was like that. It's not like walking down the street as like a celebrity or anything. But like the first thing I remember, like okay, so there's a couple cross currents here because like a whole other sort of strange part of the Dwarf Fortress experience was around say 2013. Like we had never met other game developers, right? We had
Mm-hmm.
we'd started meeting the fans like around 2008 or something, or maybe earlier. We had a Dwarf Fortress meetup with just 12 people, and we went to the Ivers, which is like a fish restaurant in Seattle, and just had dinner with a bunch of Dwarf Fortress fans, and then that was cool. And then we did
Yeah.
that again. We had it like a brewery with like 45 people, and then there was like a one that was sponsored, like the 10-year anniversary one, like a couple years ago, was at this big board game store, and we had 100 people show up, and there was like presentations, and like the people from BioWare recorded themselves talking about Dwarf Fortress, and there was an introduction by Richard Garfield that made the Magic the Gathering card game or whatever.
Oh, wow.
Just like yeah, that was like okay, that's like a weird trajectory. But then along with that trajectory of like meeting people in Seattle stuff is like meeting game developers. We never met any game developers until like 2013 or something. And then I was on a PAX panel talking about procedural generation and met like at the Indie Mega booth, I think was just starting at that time. And we met a bunch of independent game developers, and they were all cool. Like we had only heard like the bad stories about people ripping each other off, which happens very rarely, but it happens. And then like just meet all these cool people, and it's like actually awesome to
Mm-hmm.
meet all these game developers and stuff. And like so that was like a thing, right? Is like we had our fans, and we had like game industry contact people that we'd meet and stuff, right? But
Mm-hmm.
then like Zach and I went to Seattle once just for his birthday. We're like, hey, let's just hang out in Seattle and go bar hopping and stay at a hotel for a day so we can kind of be in the city or whatever, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so we went to this place called the Upstairs in Belltown in Seattle, and just got some drinks there. And then this guy walked up to us and be like, hey, did you guys make Dwarf Fortress? And we must have been it must have been from the videos or something, from like one of these panels or from the one of these interviews or something, right? Because it's like
Mm-hmm.
our face is only in a few places. But we're like, yeah, we made Dwarf Fortress, and so he bought us drinks, and we talked about. He's a physics grad student, so we talked about string theory for 5 hours or something. It's really weird. And but
I
yeah,
love it.
and that was like one of the few times. There was like a time I half count on the Seattle ferry when we were going to PAX, where someone recognized us or whatever. But then then it was like 2 weeks ago now or something, going to the subway like that's a block from my apartment. I go to the subway and just get a chicken sandwich or a turkey sandwich or whatever, And where I was just like, because the weather's been so bad, I was just like griping as I do in my friendly way to people because I ramble all the time now. I'm just like, oh yeah, you know, the weather, whatever. I work at home and I don't have air conditioning, so it's just terrible or whatever. And he's like, oh, where do you work? And I was like, oh, or what do you do, right? Because it's like working at home, that's interesting, or whatever. And I was like, oh, I make video games. And he's like, oh, no way. He's like, what type of video games do you make? And I was like, well, you know, it's a really niche thing, you know. You probably haven't heard of it because I'm like, yeah, no, I don't make like Uncharted or whatever. So I'm like, I'm just not interesting that way. And but he was like, no, I like niche games. And I'm like, well, okay, you know, have you heard of Dwarf Fortress? And he was like, well, yeah, because he's like, why would you bring up Dwarf Fortress or whatever? He's just like, well, yeah. And I was like, well, I made Dwarf Fortress. And he's like, oh shit. And yeah, and that's how I ended up with at Subway signing an autograph and taking a selfie with somebody. And so that's like part of my ongoing life because I saw him again. I walked into the store and he's like, hey, or whatever.
Oh
So
my
it's like,
gosh.
yes, that's my new life. He's moving to Italy in like a week.
Wow.
You know, that's like not my ongoing life either, fortunately or unfortunately, depending on how you like being like a local celebrity at your sandwich shop. But fortunately, no one else, as far as I know, knows about that. So I can go back to anonymity at my sandwich shop, at least until people listen to this podcast. Um,
And now they'll
and
know that there's a Subway near your house. They'll know where to scope out.
yeah, and they'll look up my picture online and stuff. And yeah, I'll be signing napkin autographs for the rest of my life. It'll be great.
Amazing. I love it though. I feel like that's got to be a lot of fun though too. Like to feel like you put in obviously so much of your own personal time and having people recognize a project of of that importance to you must feel pretty great too.
Yeah, I mean it's no, it's a cool feeling. And I mean just like it's hard to like self-diagnose what you know what's cool about it, if it's like recognition or the fact that
Right.
someone actually is playing these sort of games that we've been writing or whatever, because we went from kind of like 0 to 60 on this, right, in terms of like knowing all these different people and stuff. And so it's kind of hard to diagnose what the feelings are sometimes.
Definitely.
And but it's been like a almost wholly positive ride. I mean, the parts that aren't positive are things like how do you set up a web page, and what happens when there's downtime and your web page crashes and all that kind of like just technical stuff, right? But even that, people have been super helpful. Like Dwarf Fortress would not in a million years have been on Mac and Linux were it not for volunteers, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we had people willing to like take the like I Dwarf Fortress is not open source, and I never gave the source to people that helped us port the game because I was just kind of paranoid that it would leak or whatever. It's like an NDA doesn't mean anything if the source is out there, right? It just doesn't matter, right? It's like it's just a risk I didn't want to take. And so I was like, I'm going to make a little game called Kobold Quest, which is it's a neat little game. It's on the website. You can check it out. It's a very strange little game. And but the thing about it is that it's an open source game using the Dwarf Fortress quote unquote engine. And what I basically said was, if anyone wants to port this silly game Kobold Quest to Mac and Linux, then and put it under a license where I can share your work with everybody so that people can just use it for whatever, then because I didn't want to feel like I was profiting off it or whatever. I mean, even though I obviously am in a sense, it's like I'll do that, right? If the volunteers come forward, and the volunteers just came forward. One guy in particular, Bon was his internet name, basically did this kind of laparoscopic surgery where it's like, here's Kobold Quest, you submit your port code to me, I'll plug it into Dwarf Fortress, run it on this like Mac Mini that someone bought me for $600, and like I've got this Mac Mini. I still have the same Mac Mini. I've been doing the Dwarf Fortress Mac release has been on the same Mac for 10 years. Despite the fact that they like deprecate the operating system and stuff. I mean, it's like hanging on by a tooth. I'll have to get a new Mac at some point. And now my Linux computer died, I believe it was because Scamps the cat was rough with it.
Scamps.
This kind of thing happens, but
He's just
uh,
playing. He
that's
didn't mean
fine. I mean,
to.
it's just yeah, it's just part of the price of cat ownership is the occasional destruction of property and your whole livelihood. But what people did on that one is we managed to salvage the hard drive, and then I've got a like virtual Linux running in Windows now that they set up for me. And
Oh.
that one compiles Linux inside of Windows, and then I take that file out of the virtual computer, which is like running on a little USB stick or whatever, and then get all that together, run my Mac Mini, get that together, and then distribute that out. But that, yeah, never would have happened without these kind of community connections that formed up. And the bug tracker manager is run by 6 people that categorize the bugs and so forth, and
Wow.
there's yeah, it's really cool.
That's awesome. And have you guys been approached by like any like gaming companies or publishers or anyone that was wanting to, you know, help you guys out?
Yeah, there's been a lot of kind of like it's just all sort of individual cases, right? I mean, it's just, I'm
Mm-hmm.
not gonna name anybody
Mm-hmm.
or whatever, but it's like we someone wanted to have the Dwarf Fortress name for a project that they were working on that was going to be called just X, but they wanted to call it Dwarf Fortress colon X.
Hmm.
And it's like it's one of these weird things where it's like the numbers that they were offering didn't equal like more than a couple years pay, which is like it
Mm-hmm.
sounds like, well, you shouldn't shake a stick at that, or however that idiom goes. You should maybe take the couple years salary to tack your name on something. But we're like, well, we wanted to work on Dwarf Fortress. That's our main thing. And if they had given us like a lot of money, then we would have done it because we've been working on Dwarf Fortress and wouldn't have to like inconvenience people by begging for money. But it's like this halfway case is like, are people going to say like, oh, a bunch of sellouts or whatever, Dwarf
Mm-hmm.
Fortress colon whatever? Are we going to fail, right? Once this
Mm-hmm.
money runs out or whatever. And it's like, just decided not to go for that. And then as far as like Dwarf Fortress goes, there hasn't been like offers to like just buy it and sell it, and I think people just kind of see it for what it is now. It's just a strange project being worked on by strange people, and if they want to use it like as inspiration, then you can point at like any of number of games that have been inspired
Mm-hmm.
by Dwarf Fortress now, all across the like gamut of games in the industry, and they just do it that way, right? I mean, and that's all cool, right? That's just how games work. We were inspired by a bunch of games, and it's cool to be able to kind of pass that along to whoever wants to write games. And then the only other approaches have been things like, "Do you want to work here?" or something, and it's like, well, no.
There's a
It's
lot of
just
horror stories out there about working for other people. So might as
yeah,
well.
yeah, yeah. No more of that. No more working for people. Like if you can
But
help
since
it.
when have you really worked for somebody else? I think that's what's amazing to me is I feel like you've kind of been on this journey your whole life, and so it's like this has just been your life. Maybe it's not even a journey, like this has just been your experience, and you've been able to really. I'm assuming you love what you're doing, like so you've been able to just do what you love just through sheer force of will. It really seems like um, I can't even imagine the motivation needed
Yeah,
to
well,
push on.
it's hard. It's like, what is the motivation to like read cool books at night, right? Because it was like
Mm-hmm.
we grew up with this stuff, and so it doesn't feel like there's a motivation issue or whatever when you read about like how do you keep yourselves motivated, how do you work from home and all that stuff. It's like, well, I've been working from home since I was a 6 year old. If you want to count what I've been doing or whatever, it's not work, and that advice is
Yeah.
not useful for people
Mm-hmm.
particularly, right? I mean, it's like to try and change your whole makeup or frame of mind. I mean, it's possible to do that maybe, but it's like it's sort of a tall order to reframe things that way. And then like the part after that is just like, we were slogging with the website for a long time. We had, various sort of uh, safety nets under us in terms of like work or whatever, right? It's like the
Mm-hmm.
math thing was basically like water flowing downhill for me for long enough that I could kind of make it work as a full-time job, but also have the rest of the full time to work on games still.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's like I'm not a person who tells people like, hey, run out and quit your day job right now and mortgage your house and go make video games. It's like I did have a point where I quit my job, and it was not like a, a decision that was like I didn't have a safety net at that point. Really, I mean, I could go back and live with my parents. I have that much of a safety net, but I didn't have like a lot of money or anything like that, and I didn't have a
Mm-hmm.
house to sell or anything, and I just didn't care. There was like a point, right? Like it's I mean it's like there's a certain little piece of the story that was like total self destruction or whatever in that sense, or kind of a not giving a fuck attitude anymore or whatever, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
like it's not, and that's not a way to live. But if you're at that point, you'll know that you're at that point. You will go ahead and do it because I wouldn't be able to stop you,
Yeah.
right? So I mean that's just part of the story. Is occasionally taking a leap like that.
Mm-hmm.
The fewer the better, though, right? It's like,
Right, they're not particularly comfortable, so maybe don't put yourself through it too often. But I mean, it worked out for you, you know.
yeah, yeah. I mean, it's like this whole thing about like putting yourself out there, having a public persona to catch your opportunities when they come by. I mean, if we didn't have this weird PayPal button that I put up for my birthday before Dwarf Fortress was released, just because one of these 200 people that had kind of been following the Armok project was like, hey. I want to give you some money for your birthday. You've been working hard on this game for 6 years or whatever.
Aw.
And that was nice, right? And so he gave me
You're like,
75
yeah.
bucks. Yeah, like I'll take your $75 and I'll go out and like buy coffee and stuff. I'll have a coffee party, and it'd be great. And it's like and that button was just there. I put it on the web page so he could use it, right? It's like,
Mm-hmm.
and then it was there, and I made like another $100 or something in the intervening the 4 months up until the release. But then when Dwarf Fortress came out, it's like I had a web page, I had a PayPal button, I had $800, right? It's like
Woo.
you have these things in place, and that's why I mean it's like there's probably some reason not to have a Patreon or something, but on the other hand, everyone in the world can go out and get a Patreon now that is
Mm-hmm.
allowed on the website. I'm sure there are certain countries where it doesn't work or whatever. I don't mean to say that everyone can do it, but it's like if you're making stuff and you want people to like have an outlet for that,
Mm-hmm.
that's one thing to do. I mean, it's like having your little jar out there, and I've got one. It
I've
works.
got one.
Yeah, that's cool. It's like
Guilty.
and
I
if
mean,
you,
it's
yeah,
great.
yeah, no, if one of your episodes blows up or whatever and gets passed around just because some random person tweets you, and then suddenly that gets retweeted, and suddenly you're sitting
Mm-hmm.
on like a 15,000 tweet episode, then suddenly having that Patreon suddenly means that you're getting like another couple $100 a month or something, right? And
Mm-hmm.
then that stuff sticks for way longer than it should. It's like people just kind of fire and forget. I have Patreons that I sort of fire and forgot on, right, myself.
Mm-hmm.
And like so there's this kind of this general philosophy that we followed that wasn't. I mean, it's not like it works for everybody or whatever. I mean, it's almost like Kevin Costner's Field of Dreams or something, where it's like if you build it, they'll come or whatever. But that's like, I mean, it's a hard thing to say in like the age of like oversaturated indie games, which we kind of predated, right? When we were out there in 2006. Now there's like what, like 1,000 games being released every day or something ridiculous like
It's,
that.
it's
It's just
absolutely bonkers.
and yeah, and you just can't tell like what it's hard to stick your head out and say, hey, come over here. But it's like having those things in place lets you like catch opportunities that come along.
And
And
it's streamlined. There's a lot of streamlining of the process. I feel like that's available for people that you didn't have the opportunity to take advantage of. I think like if you look at like the modern indie market and the way that there's so many people looking for indie games specifically. I think now than maybe in the maybe 5 years ago.
Yeah,
I
no, I
think
mean,
that.
if I wanted to plunk myself in kind of the middle of how it was, it's like the people that came right before me, like say Tom Proudfoot, who made some really cool kind of evolutions of like these sort of role playing games. So he made like Knacklock and Natuk or whatever these kind of weirdly named games, but he was selling physical CDs that he had to mail to people. He had a website, but PayPal didn't exist, right?
Mm-hmm.
So he was, doing credit cards himself and all that kind of thing. And the people right before him were like going into Egghead Software with baggies and begging to sell like your baggie with your floppy disk in it, and getting a cut. Can I just like set this on the cash register and get a cut or whatever? And like and like some people made it through that and some people didn't. Like Jeff Vogel from Spiderweb Software has gone through like the whole process. He's been around for, I don't know, something like 10 years longer than I've been going or something like that. And he was doing the card swipes, but now he does the internet. Now he like puts his games on Steam and GOG and stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's like now he just gets sales there, and it works better than ever for him because he has some recognition, so his head sticks about above
The clouds.
the cloud. Yeah, because I wouldn't want to call it chaff because there's a lot of good games that are getting ignored, right? It's like it's just
100%.
it's just like the whole group of people there. And at the same time, when you look forward from where I'm at, it's like, because I had PayPal to just barely carry me through, but now people have not just Patreon, but they have Steam and they have the Humble and they have GOG and they have Itch or whatever, right? That they can just put their games up. But they also have things like Unity or whatever, right? So it's like you can just make a game, or you have Twine, you can just make a game, or you can sign up with like any of the kind of more dedicated services or something if you're using like Inkle Writer, or you're using Choice of Games platform, something like that, right? There's all kinds of stuff, and lots of different ways to get into it, and that's all cool, right? And so it's like you just have to try to adapt to the environment you're in. Whether might be the money that's hard to get, and the distribution is a little easier. The distribution's hard, but you have like a kind of niche group of fans that are really going to support you. You have to find your strengths and notice them and try and capitalize on it, and then sit there and slog for 6 years until you get lucky or whatever. Yeah.
Well, I think that you and your brother have done a fantastic job at just that.
That's
And
the
Dwarf
slog
Fortress
part for sure.
is, and Dwarf Fortress is really a testament of that. And I think that you guys continuing to make games the way that you want to make games is really admirable as well. Because I've personally talked with people who were developing games in the 80s and the 90s for major publishers, and they were miserable. Like, they say like they know people who have PTSD from working in those like traditional dev jobs, like
Yeah, I mean it's not like that's really changed either.
exactly. It's still, that environment is still very much alive in modern development as well too. Modern,
Yeah.
like it was that long
Yeah.
ago.
Yeah.
But modern if you look at the scale of technology, I guess.
Yeah, just the number of people involved too.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, was there anything else that you wanted to mention about Dwarf Fortress before we finish up?
Well, I don't know. Go to bay12games.com.
Right?
Yeah.
And there will definitely be links to Bay 12 and the social media channels in which you can follow. I'm not sure if you or your brother have personal ones, or if you guys just kind of use the Bay 12 one.
Yeah, I mean, I'm on the Bay 12 Games Twitter, and that's kind of, I mean, I'm in the weird position of that being both a personal and business account. I just don't really use it for personal stuff that often. Zach has his own Twitter, but I mean, it's a really personal Twitter, so I don't know if he really wants me screaming about it.
I'll respect his privacy, I suppose.
I don't even. Yeah. Well, I mean, the part of the problem is I don't
No.
remember what the handle is. It's like remembering someone's phone number because he doesn't tweet, right? Really,
Right, right.
he tweets out occasionally pictures of the crayon drawing. Because that's another thing to mention about Dwarf Fortress, I guess, because
Yes.
it's a free game, but if you contribute, we can send you a story that my brother will write you, like a few paragraphs with a little ASCII illustration at the top, or we can send you a crayon drawing, and those we just did that on what Wednesday was yesterday. So we did this
Yes.
yesterday. In fact, we went up to my grandma's house and did 14 crayon drawings. Normally, you can see Seattle from my grandma's house across the water. It's cool, but not yesterday because of the smoke from the fires.
Oh,
Um,
yeah.
can't even see Seattle from there. The air quality has been absolutely terrible. But in any case, we did these crayon drawings, and yeah, and I'll be mailing those out shortly. And so that's yeah, it's just like if you like the little feely stuff like that, that's
I love that.
so.
I think that's like my favorite thing of everything. In that same YouTube video, which I'll have the video I'm talking about in the show notes, along with links to Bay 12 games and the social media and all of that. But in Christian's video, where he has you guys, like, he just recorded y'all doing the crayon drawings. Like, I'm all about the personal touch, and I just think that's my favorite thing. How long have y'all been doing that for?
Oh wow. I think since around 2008 or 9,
Oh my gosh, I
because
love
it was really weird how it started. Like I because I
it.
did, like, the thing was, and this is how all the Bay 12 game stuff works, right? It's like I have the PayPal thing, right? And so PayPal sends back a confirmation notice when someone gives you $10 or whatever. And so I wanted to just send my own nice thank you note because it has the email, right? So it's hey thanks. And then I got bored just writing hey thanks, so I wrote like a little ASCII @ sign and like a C, and then I was like, the sheriff of your fort's about to be attacked by a crocodile or something, right? That's all it said. And I just wrote these silly little like signatures to my PayPal emails. And then Zach, who's like actually a writer or whatever, was like, wanted to, have some more stuff to fiddle with Bay 12 or whatever. And so I was like, well, just send me a longer story and we can send it to these people or whatever. And then we started just sending them automatically with every PayPal donation. We'd send like a little paragraph story. And then that eventually changed into like an elective thing because it got to be like too much work, like, which is the position you want to be in. It's definitely in the category of like problems you want to have, right?
Right.
It's like too many rewards for people that are sending you money. And so I was like, okay, now we'll just say like, do you want us to send you in one of these things? And that's really all it took to make the numbers manageable. Even in the Patreon days where we have like 2,000 people, it's like it's still manageable. And what happened though was back with the PayPal, like PayPal would send not just their email address, but it would send, just because of how PayPal worked back then, it would send you a shipping address. And I was like, it's just like the having to write them an email back just started bugging me. It bugged me that I had this shipping address and wasn't like fiddling with it somehow. And so I was like, well, we could like send them drawings or something. And so we just put that as an option all of a sudden on the I don't I've got to go back and find the first time we did that, because it's all sitting in my Gmail, right? It's just going to be sitting there like the very first time we wrote to somebody and said like, hey, you want a drawing or whatever. And
I
it's
love it.
possible, like yeah, I mean, and maybe gosh, some of this stuff is sourced by the community though, so I'm like wondering if I'm getting my streams crossed, because I like definitely saw the addresses and I'm definitely like thought from that time, but it could also be someone asked us to send them something the first time, because we've sent people like pieces of it's funny that there's a microcline. It's just kind of weird sounding mineral, but it's also like this bright cyan color that bothers people. Just like
Huh.
orthoclase is this bright yellow color that bothers people in the game. So we actually have mailed like little bits of microcline to people. It's just all this strange stuff that's happened in the course of
I
this
love it.
this development. But So over the years, since we've been doing that for so long, we've sent, I believe it's something like 2,500 stories and just under 2,000 crayon drawings
We
to
gotta bump
people
that number to over 2,000.
to
Easy.
people all over the world. We've sent them to. My mom used to keep like a world map where she would put pins of where we sent these things, and it's really they've been all over the place. Uh, Most countries I can think of off the top of my head that aren't like yeah, no, there's certain holes like most countries in Africa and like most of the stands.
Mhm.
No, but I mean they've definitely gone to Thailand and Vietnam, India,
Mhm.
South Korea, Japan,
Wow.
all those countries, South Africa, Egypt, Australia, Israel, and Turkey, and every country in Europe except for I don't think I've sent one to Liechtenstein.
Do you
Thinking
think
we need
that
to get a player in Liechtenstein. I'm sure there
do
is
you
one.
think that if we asked people to tweet me pictures of their drawings, they would do it?
Yeah,
To
yeah,
at
yeah,
Cake Bites, because I really want to see these drawings, and I also really want to see the people who love to play Dwarf Fortress too. But I really want to see the drawings mostly
yeah.
because what it is, or this in the
Us,
stories too. Like,
yeah, and if you want to see like it's, I mean, the social interaction part of that, like getting them to talk about them, is like the big part of that. But you can definitely see a lot if you're just like listening now. You can see a lot of the drawings if you do like a Google image search for like Dwarf Fortress crayon drawings. You'll find some, and also on the Dwarf Fortress wiki, people have been posting their stories. There's like a page on the Dwarf Fortress wiki that has hundreds of stories on it
oh
that have been
wow,
posted.
I'll make sure
Um,
to include that in the show notes for sure.
Yeah, yeah. So that's I'm sure there's other things I've missed, but that's what I remember in terms of how strange rewards because there was one like I think the microcline thing came out of like one of the Dwarf Fortress meetups was down in Redding, California. We wanted to
Hmm.
have a few people be able to drive in that weren't going to make it to the Seattle one. And so we went down to Reading, and just because it's Dwarf Fortress, we're like, hey, let's all go to like a cave, like in Mount Shasta Park or whatever.
Hmm.
And we went into this cave, and you could get minerals from the big buckets they had there, like at the gift shop or whatever. And they
Hmm.
had like I believe they had a big microcline bucket. I could be completely mistaking this with a impulse purchase or something where we got it online just to troll people with microcline in their envelopes. But
Could have been
as I
another time.
recollect, yeah, or someone shows up with a giant bag of microcline because that could have happened too. Yeah, I think like memory is really unreliable now when you come to these all the possible pasts that I've lived in where Dwarf Fortress fans or other weird things have happened that caused microcline to come into my possession. All I know is that I have a big bag of it still.
Your procedurally generated memories.
Yes, yes, it's one of the things that's really hard to do. Actually, doing like thoughts that people can talk about that aren't true and then having people remember that and then pass that around because you can imagine the data just layering on top of itself
Hmm.
as it spreads throughout the networks. I mean, we tried to do that with the identities for the secret agents. That's like the one untrue thing you can tell someone now is like your name and your job. Like, oh no, no, I'm actually, working in town as a clothes maker when you're actually a spy from a different civilization or whatever. And that alone by itself took months to do and was just a mess. So we're like, maybe people will just not be able to lie to each other about other stuff. Uh, it's, or it's
Well,
like, yeah, I guess there's this other thing where it's like, what is the Japanese idiom about like a rumor lasting 75 days or something? I could just delete false data after a time or something like that. But that doesn't work in certain. Yeah, you don't want to hear me yammering on about design because
was I
no, this
getting like a stream of consciousness
yeah,
in
that's
this
how it
moment?
works. That's my whole life basically is sitting here thinking about random Dwarf Fortress problems, and then Zach thinking about random Dwarf Fortress problems, getting together over coffee, hashing out random Dwarf Fortress problems, and then I sit in front of the computer and like take the little nuggets we've come up with that are actually doable, and then put them in the computer.
And then Scamp just comes by
Yes, he's
and
trouble.
gets you
I,
distracted.
Well, that's even after I took that Linux drive and put it into an external hard drive enclosure so I can hook it up for the virtual machine on Windows or whatever, Scamps has jumped up on that desk and pitched that thing right on the floor. I don't know if it's Linux in particular that he has a problem with, but he's yeah, it's been at least 3 times that the operating system has come under attack.
He gets mad when he loses in Scrabble to anyone who uses an X.
No, the biggest trick he ever pulled was somehow like lounging his fat little gut on my mouse and selected my entire desktop. And then somehow, it's not really a surprise because my mouse is on the right-hand side, the left button is there, and he just needs to lounge on that to like drag a window, right? Or drag a rectangle. And then, of course, with the kind of number pad over on the right, the delete key is right there. and like it's like, so I walked away from my computer, I come back, and there's my entire desktop is selected, and there's a window on the screen that's saying like, are you sure you want to delete these files? And so I was like, no, I don't want to delete these files. And I'm lucky because the enter is right next to the delete on my keyboard. If he had just like shifted his mass just a little bit, I would have lost everything.
Oh man, Scamps, he's just trying to live his best life.
He's troubled though.
Oh my gosh, Tarn, thank you so much for talking with me again. I really appreciate you taking the time, considering we talked for 2.5 hours last week also. Thank you so much for listening, and don't forget to take a look at cakebites.com for links to show notes from today's episode, as well as links to the social media where you can find me, Tarn, and Bay 12 Games. Don't forget to subscribe and review the show on whatever podcatcher it is that you prefer to listen on, and I'll see you next time.